Hello, and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alastair.
And this 17th episode, we will be talking about the new British zombie film, The Girl with All the Gifts, the latest series of long-running sci-fi sitcom Red Dwarf, and the new Blair Witch sequel. We'll also be finding out what Alastair thought of my latest recommendation, the somewhat disturbing Nazi super people comic, Uber.by Kieron, Gillen and Caanan White. But first, before all that, Alastair, what have you been doing, reading, seeing in the last 2 weeks?
Oh, this week I went down to the theatre and I went to see No Man's Land, starring Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen. So it was pretty cool to be in the same room as Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, acting in the same play. It's a really good play. It's written by Harold Pinter, who's one of my favourite playwrights. He's written some great plays. And as you can imagine, it was very, very well performed. Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen were incredibly good in their roles. They can go from funny to heartbreakingly sad to menacing, in just a few lines. It was really good.
And did they do any of their famed bromance stuff, or was that not really in the plot?
It's strange because in a lot of Pinter plays, you have two characters, and they don't explain necessarily their relationship, but they're always talking about things that kind of you don't have necessarily all the context of. So there were moments when they were incredibly chummy and as if they'd been friends for years. And then it would kind of switch, and it would be quite sinister, as if one's trying to exploit the other. I mean, I think one of the themes of the play is kind of growing old and how sort of time messes with your memories and how you forget things, and kind of your life is, I guess, what you can remember of it. So it's difficult to tell to what degree they were or were not friends, but they could be quite chummy at times, and also they could be quite sinister at times.
Okay, yeah, I've never seen them in the actual real-life flesh. Yeah, they famously did Waiting for Godot, didn't they? Another sort of classic play, which is mostly a sort of two-hander.
Yeah, I can imagine they were very good in that. I mean, these are veteran stage performers, been doing stage work on the London stage for years. You just got a real sense of how good they were as actors, the calibre of the performance. Why these are two actors at the top of their games. So I'd highly recommend it if you're in London, going to see No Man's Land. There are some quite cheap seats. I think we didn't pay a fortune for our balcony tickets, because sometimes going to theatre in London can be prohibitively expensive.
You said your tickets were technically restricted view, weren't they? But you didn't feel too restricted when you were there.
No, I think there was a safety rail in front of us a bit that was sort of obscuring the stage, but it wasn't. I didn't feel my view was impinged in any way.
Yeah, because when I see restricted view tickets, I always assume that means you'll be watching the play whilst bending around a massive column or something.
It really varies. I've been to some theatres and restricted view is just about a quarter of the stage is blocked, but you can see the rest of it pretty much fine. And I've been to a place when restricted view means there's a pillar in front of you and you can't really see anything. So it is kind of hit and miss, but these tickets were pretty good. Anyway, so what have you been up to in the last week?
I watched the first couple of episodes of the relaunch of Cold Feet, the sort of slightly upscale middle-class soap from the 90s. But yeah, I used to watch it when I was a teenager, even though it was about sort of people in their, I think, late 20s, early 30s, so whether it was actually technically aimed at me, I'm not sure, but it was always kind of fun in a sort of good-seeming but quite gentle way. And they're back for a new series, like any franchise with even a hint of name recognition is at the moment, and it's quite fun. Helen Baxendale's character was killed at the end of the original run. I don't think it's a huge spoiler to say that at this stage. It's over a decade old, and I gather, because they couldn't really think of a non-shit way to do it, they haven't brought her back as a ghost or anything, but the rest of the cast are all there, which I think is the main thing.
Yeah, I remember that show when it was originally on TV. I remember it being good. I don't remember it really being exceptional. I think it's an odd choice of something to bring back. I guess it's got a fan base that want to see more of it.
I mean, I think the good thing about bringing it back, I guess, is it never really had a plot beyond soapy things happen to these people, so it's not completely beyond the realms of possibility that more soapy things will happen to these people. It's just bringing the same characters back, picking up where they are now, and then throwing more crap at them, basically. They are managing to avoid one of the big pitfalls of these revivals, in that they do seem quite willing and happy to make the characters a bit miserable. There's none of this sort of, look, it's the characters you love and it's warm and nice and nothing bad's going to happen to them because we know you love them so much. There's, it's Cold Feet. Slightly depressing things are going to happen to the characters. Yeah, it's a sort of cushy middle-class ITV drama, but I think the odds of genocide happening to them is probably quite low. But, there's a sense that they could do stupid things or have bad things forced upon them. Yeah, it's just depressing enough to feel resonant, but ultimately it's still kind of nice, warm comfort viewing. The actors are, a lot of them, especially I think Hermione Norris and James Nesbitt, sort of went on from Cold Feet to become titans of British drama.
Yeah, James Nesbitt's very good. I thought he was really good in that Stephen Moffat version of Jekyll and Hyde. I think it was just called Jekyll. That was good.
Yeah, a major new British drama with James Nesbitt in it is just something that happens, I think. Seems to be just one of those actors who can sell almost anything on his natural charm and talent. So the fact that he's come back is pretty good, I think. There was an entertaining joke in the first episode about the fact that James Nesbitt has visibly much more hair now than he did when Cold Feet actually finished.
Draw attention to these things, hang a lantern on it.
I mean, fortunately, all the characters in Cold Feet have quite sort of cushy lives. You know, it's not some kitchen sink drama about life on the estate. You know, the character is sort of this international high-flying IT consultant, so it's not completely out of the realms of possibility he might have had a hair transplant, especially as part of the plot in new series is that he's now seeing a woman much, much younger than him.
I guess that all makes sense in context.
Yes, you can sort of hang a flame on the whole midlife crisis thing. But yeah, no, it's good. It's good fun. It's one of the better revivals of things I've seen lately. It's certainly better than at least one of the two revivals of things we're going to be talking about later.
First up this week, we will be discussing The Girl with All the Gifts, a new sci-fi film based on the book by MR Carey. Melanie is a bright young student who likes learning and hearing Greek myths, especially when read by her favourite teacher, Miss Justino. What makes Melanie different from most children is that her school is on a military base in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. I love this book. It's one of my favourite novels, and I was very excited to see they're making a film of it. We actually saw a special preview screening on my birthday, so that was very nice. But Nick, what did you think of the film?
I thought it was pretty good. I think it was. I'd also read the book. It is a really, really good book, and I don't think it was as good as the book, but it was very nicely shot and sort of thoughtful focus on detail, and the sort of shrieking soundtrack works quite well, I think. And for me, the book stood out most. There are probably going to be a lot of book comparisons. Sorry, it's kind of hard to avoid. The book stood out most for me because of the very, very strong character writing. It really dug into the 4 or 5 main characters and their backgrounds and what motivated them, and the sort of the incredibly good idea behind it and ending. And the film, I would say, very successfully translated the ideas, but perhaps because, I guess, of limited time, didn't as successfully translate the amazing character writing.
Yeah, I seem to remember from the book that the kind of the beginning part of the book, so the first section in the school, was much longer in the book, and I think maybe that's because, you know, in a book you have to describe a lot of things and really build the atmosphere over several chapters, whereas in a film you can do that much faster using kind of visual and audio as well as spoken words. So I think they kind of save some time by visually introducing you to the school rather than it being sort of described so in the book in such detail. But the book has a really good opening in that, how it so vividly paints a picture of this character Melanie and this strange school she's in. And they start with kind of a really kind of tight introduction to it in the film.
Yeah, I think ultimately a lot of it is, as I say, just time. I mean, they couldn't include every beat that was in the book because ultimately then it would have to have either been a trilogy or a 5-hour epic. So in order to get through the plot in a sort of, I think it's about an hour and 3/4. Yeah, I think they had to shoot through some stuff. On the other hand, part of me feels they could have probably taken it up to 2 hours or so, at least, and actually got into stuff in more detail. On the other hand, there were actually parts in the middle where I was starting to think, I'm actually getting kind of bored, so it's hard to tell.
It is a very faithful adaptation to the book. They haven't really changed very much, and they kept pretty much most of the plot, just kind of condensed it down a bit for the film.
Yeah, I think the take, Mike Carey being the writer for whom MR Carey is his current prose pseudonym. I just always think of him as Mike Carey because that was the name he wrote under when he was writing comics in the sort of 2000s. Having known his work from when he was writing comics in the 2000s, it is quite nice to see him finally have this sort of big break and go huge. Yeah, I mean, as I said, the main appeal, I guess, of the book was the cool ending and the cool sort of school concept at the beginning and the way Mike Carey did it and then executed it. I guess we should probably try not to spoil the ending, since the ending is really awesome and one of the best bits.
Yeah, it has a very, very good ending, and it's not the ending you are expecting at all from a zombie film. So I think we should try and keep it not spoiled, at least, or save spoilers for an extended fantasy violence.
It's okay. I don't really have a lot to say critically about the ending, to be honest. I think the ending is a faithful adaptation of the ending from the book. It's good in the book, it's good in the film. The ending isn't something I feel the need to massively critique either way.
It's a good ending, yeah. They brought all the characters from the book to life well, but maybe, I don't know, not quite as, I guess, subtly as is in the book, because there's not as much time. Paddy Considine plays Sergeant Parks, who's kind of the military officer in charge of safety, who's quite hard-boiled and aggressive. And I think Paddy Considine plays the part really well. He's a really good actor, been in some of my favourite films. In the book, they have this kind of much more developed character arc for Sergeant Parks. Like right at the beginning, he's like terrifying and like aggressive and a bit of a bully. And as time goes by, you kind of get to know him more, and the character softens as also Melanie sort of helps him out from some dangerous circumstances. They have a bit of that in the film. He starts off being like sort of angry and aggressive, and then has a character arc where he sort of mellows a bit. But I think it's done more subtly in the book. The same with Miss Justineau, played by Gemma Arterton. So in the book, it starts like Melanie's just kind of in awe of Miss Justineau. It's like it's her favourite teacher, and she's like hangs on every word that she says. And then as we go through the book and the characters get to know each other, it kind of shows how she's a real human being with kind of human frailties and vulnerabilities. She's not perfect. In fact, she's quite a flawed person. And they kind of do that kind of quite good transition from the pedestal that Melanie puts Justineau on to her being like a regular human being. And they do that in the film as well, but I think because they cut out some of the characterization to make it shorter to fit in the film. Some of the stuff they lost was from like the subtleties of the Justineau and Parks characters.
I'd rate the transition for Parks above the transition for Justineau, to be honest. I think I'm not 100% sure if it's the writing or if I just didn't entirely buy Gemma Arterton as Miss Justineau. But yeah, I thought Sergeant Parks, I mean, yes, it's a sort of slightly sped over, truncated version of their relationship from the book, but I do think the arc of Parks's relationship with Melanie actually comes across a lot more clearly in the film. Like, their sort of growing mutual respect for each other and trust is actually there. Parks gets to be shown to have his relationship and his feelings sort of changing and developing, whereas Miss Justineau, after her first few scenes in the schoolroom, she didn't really have that much to do, it felt like, and it didn't feel particularly nuanced. I think there was like one scene with her and Parks having a drink. There was a few bits where they were sort of flirting, and then there was a very, very brief shot of their chat while having a drink. And yeah, I don't know, I didn't feel Miss Justineau really got a particularly good shake in the film, to be honest. I came away feeling like she was just the teacher who Melanie idolised, and I don't know if they really did fit in that much of her humanisation. Yeah, and I think some of the scenes have more impact in the book. There's a very powerful scene in the book right at the beginning when sort of in class Melanie and Miss Justineau have a moment. Like Justineau touches Melanie's hair, which you're completely not supposed to do in this school because like all the kids are sort of strapped down in these kind of Hannibal Lecter sort of restraints for the teacher's protection. And in the book, it's this like heartbreaking moment, and Justineau wanting to give Melanie some like genuine human contact. And it's like, yeah, it's so powerful. I think it made me cry when I read it. And it's in the film, but it just doesn't have the same impact. I think it's because they kind of go through it a bit quicker. And well, it's like the first scene she's in, isn't it? It's her like first introductory scene is her coming into the classroom, reading a story, and then touching Melanie's hair.
Yeah, whereas it takes several chapters to get to that in the book. It kind of builds up the sense of what like a normal school day is like. They do really well in the film the bit after that when Parks comes in and basically says, "You can't touch these kids, and I'll show you why," and kind of spits on his hand and puts his hand kind of in front of one of the kids' masks. And the kid is changed from being a polite, sort of intelligent school kid into a snarling, hungry beast, because they are these. I think, well, this isn't spoiling it too much, but the twist is these kids are sort of zombie children. They're kind of part human, part zombie.
Well, but I don't think we need to go into exactly what the deal is with the kids, but yeah, the kids are zombies, basically.
Yeah, and that's why they're strapped down so that they don't eat the flesh of the teachers, but they're trying to teach them to be human, or at least trying to see to what degree they can respond to sort of a normal human environment. And it's very good in the book how there's Justin who really sees Melanie as a person, everyone else sees Melanie as a thing and something to be feared, and then they go through a good transition with that, and I thought that was handled quite well in the film.
And the other major character we haven't mentioned probably is Glenn Close as Dr. Caldwell, and Glenn Close as probably definitely the biggest film star in this is very good and very charismatic, and she gets a lot of sort of fun bits of her character being either snarky or desperate or sort of coldly snippy.
Yeah, she's very good. I think she was one of the ones who probably, brought her character to life the most. In the book, I felt she was, classic cold scientist, and that she sees Melanie purely as a thing to be kind of tested and then sliced up to have her brain analysed. In the film, Glenn Close does bring a sort of humanity to the character and sort of gets across her motivation quite well and why, researching these children is important to save humanity. There's a very good scene between Melanie and the Glenn Close character at the end of the film, which I thought was handled very well, but I don't want to spoil it too much because it's the end.
Yeah, I think the edge of like genuine desperation, because Glenn Close is again very good, it sort of comes across throughout her performance, and it does make the character seem a bit more alive and three-dimensional. Yes,
Yeah.
it's good. Glenn Close is surprisingly very good, and because there was a tiny Q&A before our screening, we got to be in the same room as Glenn Close, which was beyond thrilling. Although because there were about 5 people on screen, they only got to say about 20 words each, but still.
That was good. That was, thanks to the BFI for putting on that special preview
And selling us tickets for money.
Yeah, but also it was really tense, I thought, in some places. Like they get out of the school and into London, which is obviously filled with, or Hungries they're called, which is the kind of the zombies of this world. And there's definitely some very tense bits when they're trying to sneak around, avoid disturbing the Hungries so that huge swarms sort of descend on them. Because even though they've got a few guns, there's no way they can fight their way out. And there's some genuinely quite disturbing bits in the film. I thought they did a really good job of really getting across powerfully how awful some of it is. There's a pretty horrible bit when they meet a Hungry who's sort of just idly pushing a pram around, and it's just the creepiest thing. Just this kind of square just full of Hungry is just kind of completely immobile and static, and there's just kind of the sound of just one sort of slowly pushing this trolley around. And then, again, I don't want to spoil too much about the scene, but then something quite unpleasant happens, and it really is very visceral, quite shocking. They really found a good way to get that impulse in the viewer and kind of grab that and squeeze it. Although it's unpleasant, it's powerful and effective filmmaking, so I really liked that.
Yeah, possibly I've become slightly immune to basic zombie tropes because I just watched 6 years of The Walking Dead, and people walking around near zombies has become quite, routine for me.
Yeah.
The zombie stuff in the middle was quite fun. Although the one thing that I did crack a laugh at was always when you saw zombies sort of milling around outside standard British high street shops like Costa and Next. Just because it's nearly always either American shops or generic nothing shops. The fact that they actually had them standing around outside Tesco was quite funny for me for some reason.
Yeah, and just how the sort of the hospital I think they take shelter in just looked like one of those Victorian hospitals that was redone in the 70s. It's so familiar, and it kind of makes it a bit more powerful because I guess we're so used to these American sort of versions of things in an American culture, and kind of when it's American culture it reinforces to the degree that this is a fantasy. It's not it's harder to put yourself into the story, but then it kind of does make it seem much more real and much more believable when the zombie story has things you recognise from your everyday life in it, like you saying Costa and Next and kind of high street brands and boots that we recognise and stuff.
They were obviously on quite a small budget. They managed to squeeze quite a lot of horror out of that budget, so good for them.
Yeah, it did look really impressive and stuff. They managed extras they got, and how they managed to close down kind of whole high streets and stuff so they could just fill it with their Hungries and make it kind of really look like it was deserted. And also the way that how everything was really overgrown, I thought was interesting. So they'd be walking down a high street and there'd be 2 foot high weeds and ivy on everything and stuff, and they really did a good way of getting across it. The world has collapsed and everything's kind of been abandoned, and nature is sort of reclaiming the urban spaces that's just filled with shuffling mindless creatures,
which ties into the themes of the whole story, I guess, and what happens at the end.
Yeah, exactly. And for probably what wasn't a particularly high budget, British independent film, they didn't have the sort of budget that World War Z has. But I think actually they did a better job of showing the little things that would happen in a post-apocalyptic universe, just the degree to which nature would reclaim the urban environment.
Well, I think little things is kind of the key, really, because the director Colm McCarthy does, I think, do quite a lot of focusing in on tiny details, or showing your twig being snapped as zombies marched across it, and small little things happening to make you jump on a smaller scale rather than holy shit, the entire street is overrun with 17 million zombies. And it's very sort of slow and thoughtful, but when it works, which it does for most of the film, it's very, very atmospheric, especially with the sort of shrieking soundtrack they've got going on as well.
Yeah, I thought the soundtrack was phenomenally good. They had a really good, I don't want to say it's not atonal, but it's a vocal soundtrack. There's no words, it's just kind of making unusual sounds vocally, and it's just really creepy and really puts you on edge. And I think I was saying yesterday when we were talking about Blair Witch, we'll come to in a bit, that one of the ways that horror works is the kind of, it needs to create the sort of sustained sense of you being a bit unsettled and you kind of outside your comfort zone, which kind of weakens your defenses, and then they can hit you with something that's either visceral or creepy or overtly frightening, and it kind of has a much more powerful emotional effect. And I think that soundtrack was just great at kind of constantly putting you a bit on edge, constantly stopping you, relaxing, making you feel this is not my comfort zone, this is something strange is going on. And then they could hit you with some of the properly grim scenes.
Well, yeah, because it's not quite what you expect. It's slightly outside of what you normally, consider music, I guess. It's just sort of these bursts of noise. I think I saw one review being somewhat critical of the soundtrack, saying threw them off and took them out of the film. But yeah, I don't know, I really liked it. I thought it added to my general sense of unease, which, as you say, is very much what you're after in these sort of creeping around survival horror films where things could jump out and eat you at any moment. I did try and buy the soundtrack, or at least look into the possibility of buying it the next day after we saw it, but as far as I can tell, it doesn't seem to be on sale anywhere. So if
not yet. maybe in the future.
It's true, but you think there would be like a pre-order link. Yeah, I don't know. In the event that the producers of Go with All the Gifts are listening to this, which you never know, is the soundtrack coming out? Do tell us.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me very much of The Neon Demon, which is again another film that's very good at creating this kind of sustained sense of being slightly unsettled and outside your comfort zone to kind of grind down your defences. And like the soundtrack to that film, strange kind of electronica, is very much a part of that. And I think in this film, like the way they use sound is very much a part of sort of creating this sustained sort of sense of being slightly unsettled and things being slightly abnormal. And again, and seeing things like Boots completely overgrown or like a British high street, but just like that's completely sort of crumbled, disintegrated, really, again, helps you to have that sustained sense of, you know, this isn't normal, I'm outside my comfort zone. Or like, again, even at the beginning with the school, when this is clearly, you know, a school like we would recognise, but why are they got sort of like military level security? Why are like 10-year-olds in Hannibal Lecter style restraints? It's very much kind of, we're definitely not in our version of reality now, and I feel decidedly unsettled by the things I'm seeing. So it was very atmospheric, which I think there was a strong sense of that atmosphere in the book, and they managed to carry across that to the film very well.
Yeah, I did go into this with high-ish expectations because, you know, it was a book I really liked, and over the writer of the book, MR/Mike Carey, was very much involved with the film as well. Like, he wrote the screenplay. So, you know, I did hope it would be a fairly good, faithful adaptation rather than just the vague concept heavily bastardised. And yeah, it was good, it was strong. I'd probably say the book was better, but ultimately just because it had more time and space to do character work. But this was, you know, a bit of fun British zombie film. Although as British zombie things go, I probably still prefer In the Flesh.
I think when you go to see an adaptation of one of your favourite books on your birthday, you do have high expectations, but the film met my high expectations. Wasn't the best thing I've seen this year, but it was very, very good, and I like it. And if you liked the book, I'd recommend seeing it. If you like zombie things, I recommend seeing it. If you're a bit tired and bored of zombies, then I'd say this isn't your average zombie film. You know, if you're a fan of like In the Flesh, you know, something that does like a slightly different take on zombies, this is a really good kind of refreshing, interesting, well characterized take on zombies.
But yeah, definitely read the book. That's fucking great. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about the 11th series of Red Dwarf, or the first 2 episodes of it at least. Red Dwarf, of course, is the sci-fi sitcom that started in the late 80s on BBC Two in the UK. I'm actually curious how big this is in America. I don't know whether American listeners will have a clue what we're talking about. I assume it's been around long enough to have at least a sort of fringe of awareness among sort of geeky section of culture, but who knows?
I think it's got a following amongst sort of Anglophile Americans and geeky Anglophile Americans mainly.
Fair enough. Okay, anyway, Red Dwarf is a sci-fi sitcom about a guy called Dave Lister, played by Craig Charles, who finds himself alone in deep space after he's in suspended animation due to having an illegal cat. And then there's a radiation leak, all the crew dies, the ship keeps him in suspended animation for 3 million years to let the radiation die off, and then he wakes up and discovers he's alone in the middle of nowhere with just a hologram of his annoying bunkmate, played by Chris Barry, a creature who evolved from his illegal cat, played by Danny John Jules, and later joined by the reprogrammed serving robot Crichton, played by Robert Llewellyn. And yes, it's ran for 8 series, pretty consistently over 10 years in the late 80s and 90s. Then it disappeared for a decade and was brought back by the British comedy repeats channel Dave. Yes, again, Americans, yes, we have a channel called Dave, who I think had been having some good ratings from the repeats, so they brought back Red Dwarf. This is the 3rd series of Red Dwarf on Dave. The first one was mostly quite bad, the second one was mostly alright, and this 3rd one, which logically should be mostly pretty good. Alastair, was it?
Well, going into this, I kind of had a lingering kind of sensation in the back of my head of saying, you know, what's the point? Kind of, is Red Dwarf something that needed to be resurrected? I mean, I liked Red Dwarf when I was a kid. I remember watching quite a lot of Red Dwarf. I remember actually watching Red Dwarf on the night of the millennium in 1999. It's one of the things I did. I did like, but I wasn't like a mega fan. Like, think this is one of the best sitcoms ever. So I was very much kind of, when it came back, I was a bit kind of take it or leave it. Did watch the first series after I brought it back and thought it was really bad. So I was kind of going into this with sort of low expectations, you know, but an open mind. We saw 2 episodes. I think the first one was a bit clunky and kind of reminded me of all the bad aspects of bringing back, you know, something that's not been around for ages. That kind of, it had all the sort of the negative criticism of that, which we can go into in a bit. And then the second episode I thought was very good. It made me laugh a lot. It was really funny. It was up to the quality of the classic series of Red Dwarf. I wouldn't say it's one of the best episodes of Red Dwarf ever, but it wouldn't feel out of place in one of those classic series sitting alongside some of the best episodes they've ever done. So it goes to show they can still write funny stuff. The 4 principal actors are very good in their parts. They've clearly really settled into the roles. They're very comfortable. If you enjoy watching those people playing those 4 characters doing kind of the same sort of types of jokes they've always done, you get more of that, and it is funny. So yeah, I'd say one for the fans, but fans won't be disappointed.
Yeah, and for the record, I guess a small note on spoilers: the second episode doesn't air on the TV channel Dave until the evening after we release this podcast, but it has been up on the UK TV preview site. There's sort of on-demand video site since last Thursday, so we'll try not to spoil it in detail, but we may imply some spoilers. So if you're operating a hardline anti-spoiler policy about the second episode of Red Dwarf 11, you may want to listen to this after you've seen it. Anyway, yeah, I think they've definitely found some money since the previous Dave series, in which they clearly had to spend the entire budget on building a decent-looking Red Dwarf set, and as a result, they could barely afford to leave that Red Dwarf set. You did have quite a lot of episodes in Red Dwarf 10 where the plot didn't really kick in until about 10 minutes in, because they just talked in their bunk for the first 10 minutes of the episode. Whereas in both these episodes, A, they actually leave the ship. Clearly, having built their Red Dwarf set, they can now afford to leave the ship again. And I think it does play a massive role in actually making it seem more dynamic and more interesting. And B, the plot does start pretty much right off the bat. There's actually, by Red Dwarf standards, they actually get into it quite quickly. I guess there's one scene at the beginning of the second episode where they're playing a board game, but even that does tie into what's happening in the plot.
Yeah, and like I say, the writing is, when it's good, is as good as it ever was. I think the first episode, just to go into a bit more detail, like the writing was quite clunky. I didn't find it particularly funny in places. It was very much kind of Red Dwarf by numbers. There's an obvious joke about, Rimmer, played by Chris Barry, being sort of an unsufferable coward. There was a joke about the cat being rude and disliking Rimmer. There was a joke about Crichton being sort of subservient because he's like a servitor. And it was very much felt like they're just kind of doing it.
It's their first episode of the series, I guess. You have to do this sort of introductory, here are the characters and here are what they're like stuff. Realistically, yes, a lot of people who watch this are watching this because they like it, but you have to at least live in the world where you might be introducing the characters to a new viewer.
No, that is true. That is true. But I do feel there was some quite clunky writing. There was a sort of kind of quite contrived plot that didn't really make a lot of sense to hang a few not very funny jokes on it. It made me think like this shows that the show is too old at this point and kind of a bit past it, and maybe not the sort of thing that should be brought back if they can't create some good funny scripts for it. Then what's kind of the point? And then the second episode happened, and I realised they can create some good funny scripts for it, and they can come up with original ideas. So it's very much a kind of, when it's good, and you remember why you like the show, you remember why it's so popular, why its popularity has endured for so long. And when it's bad, it really reminds you of why we have this kind of slightly ridiculous obsession with reviving things for nostalgia's sake when they really shouldn't be.
I didn't hate the first episode as much as you seem to. I do agree the second episode was stronger in pretty much all measurable ways, but the science speakeasy plot, I mean, I wouldn't want to make an epic trilogy about it, but I thought it was a funny enough idea to hang one episode of a sitcom off.
Yeah, it had some funny moments, yeah.
The bit where the main guest in the speakeasy gives a lengthy speech in which she describes various science things as if she's offering them sex acts was quite funny.
I don't do the Big Bang.
Yeah.
Probably the funniest bit in the whole thing.
So, and yes, once they got into that bit, and yeah, the bit where they smashed up that toaster in the street because all technology is illegal, I laughed. The bit about Dave Lister stealing a car, Kevin Eldon as a sort of one of two bickering robots. It did sort of end a bit suddenly. I think both of them, to be honest, if I had to find a consistent criticism of both of them, they both did just kind of stop.
I think they both had kind of, this is the situation, we're going to move through it, kind of revealing what's going on in a sort of humorous way as it goes. And once we get to the end, it's kind of, well, there's not very much dramatic tension here, so we're just going to kind of stop.
Ultimately, if they manage to do, here's the situation and here's the comedy, then, you've successfully created a sitcom. You could let it off slightly easier than you might have a dramatic show for having a bit of a it's over now bye ending. But yes, I do feel that both of them would have probably been punched up a bit by having a climactic feeling ending rather than just it's over now bye. But the second episode was really good. The second episode, I think one of the reasons why it felt like classic Red Dwarf is that the sci-fi did actually feel like he was taking the sci-fi aspect vaguely seriously and thinking it through and then working out how to be funny with it. And the use of flashbacks to introduce the sci-fi concept and maybe give it at least a hint of pathos was a nice extra layer. And not something I've actually seen that much on Red Dwarf, so it's good to see them, pushing themselves a bit.
That was certainly good. Yeah, you're right, that the fact they had a sort of, a sci-fi plot and jokes to ride from it made it seem like, kind of, that was good writing. It wasn't just a kind of, like, the first one was like a vague concept that didn't make a lot of sense just to hang a few jokes on. The other really strong appeal of Red Dwarf is just how good those 4 principal actors are in playing those parts, and how they've really honed the art of just being those characters and interacting in like a kind of in a very funny way. Like the second episode did that really well. Like you said, it opens with Lister and Rimmer playing a board game, and you can just tell that like Chris Barry and Craig Charles are like so relaxed into the roles, and like they do these parts so well that you could just watch them kind of just sitting and kind of arguing, playing a board game, and their reactions, and it's just really funny. And like there's another great scene in the second episode when Lister's trapped with Kat, and it is just the two of them talking in this kind of like sort of extended dialogue, but it's just really funny because they've kind of nailed the characters, they've nailed the reactions. They're really good at playing those parts. That's one of the reasons why Red Dwarf is so loved and why it's popular enough that Dave wants to bring it back. But yeah, they just are great in the parts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why Red Dwarf endures when a lot of other sci-fi comedies barely get past series 1. It's a sci-fi comedy, but it's not a parody. The characters are actually interesting characters who aren't just direct analogues to shit from other shows. It's not just a Star Trek derivative, it's not just here's the captain, here's the Spock, here's the Uhura. I don't know enough about Star Trek to keep going down that road, but they have bothered to come up with a genuinely specific sci-fi concept which is theirs, and characters which they have actually thought through and taken seriously to an extent.
No, exactly, yeah. And I think it's a good point you made that it's not a spoof, it is comedy in a sci-fi setting, and Red Dwarf works best when it takes the science aspect seriously, like things in the classic episodes like Polymorph or Me Squared. They kind of the scientific aspects are very much a part of it, but the humour comes from the characters. What I also really like about Red Dwarf is also one of the things I really like about Alien is that their vision of the future is kind of a bit grotty and a bit crap.
Yeah.
In the future, there will still be shit jobs, and people will have to do them.
Well, yeah, and workplace type things where people do shit jobs is a fairly standard comedy setting. You just have to, extrapolate it into the future.
Yeah, it's not a utopian, perfect sort of post-scarcity future that like Star Trek has, or something like that. It's a very much a kind of things will be crap in the future, just as they're crap now.
Yes, exactly. And yeah, like picking up what you said about the extended Lister Cat bit. Perhaps another reason why the second episode felt particularly fresh and good. That's not actually a dynamic they often do. The cat, even though he's been in, he's probably one of the only characters who's been in every episode, and yet he's never been extensively explored. He's often just been kind of there as a sort of light relief, silly comedy character. I mean, Vimmer and Lister normally get at least a bit of pathos. Even Crichton gets some pathos sometimes. The cat, even though, his entire species are dead and he's just as alone in the universe as Lister, really. They don't really play it for pathos that much. He's just there to make jokes about his self-obsession and his vanity. And
yeah, the cat is always going to be my least favourite character, partly because it is a kind of a one-note character in that the whole joke of Cat is like, what if a cat was a human? Like, how would they behave, And, he sort of behaves like a cat, but obviously it's funny to see like a person do it. I mean, there's a great joke, like I think in like the second episode when they like give him a bowl of water on the floor, and he just looks disgusted and goes, "You guys eat off the floor?" But all the jokes are basically just kind of around that.
There's an exchange in the second episode, which was possibly one of my favourite bits, where the cat and Lister have an argument about why a cat would evolve so it can't see in the dark.
Yeah,
I giggled myself silly on that.
That was very funny. Yeah.
In terms of the cat being, I don't know, he is probably the least developed character, as I said, but I've never really seen him as my least favourite, because I don't get the feeling that, it's not as if he's an incredibly thin character, but the writers insist on giving him hours of screen time. He's a thin character, and he's definitely the fourth place character. He's always written in that way.
I mean, all the characters had moments that are very true to their characters. If you really like that dynamic, if you really like the characters, if you really like the way they're written, there is lots of stuff here for you to enjoy. I don't particularly know if it's going to be winning over any new fans, because it's not doing anything interesting, unusual, or radical with the setup. If you like classic Red Dwarf, you will like this.
I mean, the Red Dwarf, I think, in the accepted wisdom, one of the two co-creators, Rob Grant, left after the Series 6, and it was then carried on by the remaining co-creator, Doug Naylor, and as a general consensus, it hasn't been as good or as funny since then. But this is probably one of my favourite episodes of the era since Doug Naylor took it over solo. This is, I actually think, one of the best episodes in the last 4 or 5 series. I don't know if the world will agree with me on that, but I really liked this. Could have used a stronger ending, but other than that, I was pretty happy with it.
I would agree with you on that. I don't know about the world, but I would certainly agree that was one of the best Red Dwarf episodes I've seen in quite a while.
And also, it's weird that I like it this much. The theory I've seen posted on like Red Dwarf fan sites in terms of episode quality is less Rimmer equals less good, i.e. the good episodes are nearly always the ones that have a lot of Rimmer in them, because Rimmer is the most developed character and Chris Barry is probably the best performer. So yeah, it's surprising to me, I guess, in a way, that I like this episode this much, because it's comparatively light on the Rimmer. I mean, Kat almost probably has more to do than Rimmer in this episode.
Craig Charles is very good as Lister, and I think there was quite a lot of Lister in this second episode, and he is very good. Especially like the moments when like Lister and the cat, and like Lister is the clever one, which is, that's a funny dynamic.
I don't think Lister's meant to be an idiot, is he necessarily? He's not a genius, but I think he's probably a reasonably bright, okay human being. He just doesn't really try.
He's a chronic underachiever, yeah.
Yeah, but I wasn't taking a shot at the other performers by saying less Rimmer equals less good. I just like Rimmer more. He's brilliant, but...
I just want to make a point that like how Craig Charles is very good in this role, and like I say, because he left Coronation Street, I believe, to do more Red Dwarf, and you can tell because he really likes playing this part. He really likes performing with these other actors. Yeah, it's probably the greatest thing he's going to achieve in his professional career, most likely at this point. But not many actors get to be in a classic sitcom, that's beloved, certainly all over the country, and parts of the world. So why wouldn't you want to make more of that? If you enjoy making it, you enjoy hanging out and acting with these people, you enjoy the process, and you've got adoring fans that, generally respond well to the show. I mean, why wouldn't you want to make more? And
I think these 4 actors, this is probably going to be the iconic thing they're remembered for. So yeah, if Dave are happy to fund it and the fans are still turning out, so I don't think there's any reason they shouldn't make more. And based on, the massive amount of promotion Dave have done for this new series, and as you say, the fact that Craig Charles left his regular gig at Coronation Street to do this, I'm assuming there is going to be a push to do at least a substantial amount more. They've already filmed Series 11, like this current series, and Series 12 for next year. I wouldn't be entirely surprised to hear an announcement at some point in the next 6 months that they're gearing up to film Series 13. Unless ratings completely tanked, it seems to be an effort to bring this back as a going concern.
Yeah, exactly. And it's still very popular. Its popularity has endured. And I can see why they'll keep making it, because people will keep wanting to watch it, because it is this kind of iconic chapter in the history of British comedy.
And I'm okay with that now, to be honest, because there was a period where you sort of feel like a slight guilty sense of, I am watching this because it's Red Dwarf, I'm not sure if it's actually good, this is coming heavily from my nostalgia gland, am I bypassing my taste here? But yeah, I feel okay about watching these current episodes. I felt mostly okay about watching Series 10, and I feel very okay about watching Series 11. I think that, I can feel like, yes, this is genuinely entertaining. I am happy watching this. This is decent.
No, I think I'd agree with that. Yeah, I mean, it's especially the second episode. It was good. It made me laugh, and like I say, it's up to the standard of classic Red Dwarf. So yeah, I think if you like Red Dwarf, there's lots to enjoy here. If you're new to Red Dwarf but are intrigued by what we're saying, maybe recommend starting with the Series 1. I mean, it's not like there's a consistent plot you really have to follow, but the classic series are better. But but if you're a fan, I'd say this is you won't be disappointed.
Yeah, and the first 8 series I think are on Netflix. And I think they've also got most of them up on the UK TV app thing if you're in the UK, so you can watch them for free on the internet for the price of a few adverts.
Next up, we'll be discussing The Blair Witch, a sequel to 1999 found footage surprise hit The Blair Witch Project. The plot picks up 15 years on from the original, when the younger brother of Heather, who was the main character in the original Blair Witch Project, he ventures back into the same forest to try and find his sister. This is after he finds a video card that has possibly some footage of her. They wander into the forest with some friends, one who's a documentary filmmaker who is obviously recording all of this in order to find out what happened and if there's any truth to the legend. And as you can expect, creepy things start to happen, and it all goes wrong in a fairly similar way to the way it went wrong 15 years ago. Yeah, so we went to see this last night. Nick, what did you think of it?
It starts with some promising bits, and the character introductions are fine. They introduce the characters and delimit them fairly well. It's not too stock cliche. And then after about a third or so of the film, it pretty much turns shit and stays shit. For vaguely defined reasons. And, the Blair Witch and what it is and what it can do has always been quite vaguely defined, so whatever. Time starts to go funny around the forest, and then it basically becomes permanent night. And then it just goes dark, and then the entire film just becomes about an endless sequence of people running through forests and shouting and screaming each other's names. There's not really that much time for characterization, conversations, or dialogue. It's just an endless series of sort of quite standard jump scares. There's a couple of bits that successfully made me jump. There's a couple of interesting ideas, which I'll probably go into more detail about in a bit. But all in all, didn't really feel they did much promising. It was basically just a not as good reiteration of the first one. And I did quite like the first one, just to be clear. This isn't me going into something I didn't like and then watching the sequel to it to inevitably dislike that as well. I thought the first one was, as a sort of character piece between the three principals, the first one was actually quite good because it didn't play up the massive obvious horror. It did just sort of focus on sort of, even towards the end, sort of low-key weirdness happening and the characters sort of slowly reacting to it and becoming unhinged, and their acting, I mean, perhaps partly because of the sort of semi-improvised way it was shot, or perhaps they were just better better actors, or better directed, I don't know. But the character interactions were quite nicely done and enjoyable, and they seemed real, and it made the horror, even though it was quite low-key, come through a bit more. Whereas in this, a lot of the interactions are quite standard, scripty and stagey, and they don't really get that much time to have that many of them, to be honest, because, as I say, about a third of the way in, it just darkness descends, and they almost never have another complete conversation again. They just run around and scream a lot. I think I've probably talked enough for one section now, but in summation, no.
No, it wasn't very good. It didn't make me feel that scared and stuff. And I was kind of, at first, the intro was kind of a bit creepy when if you don't know what's going on, obviously, like, there's 6 characters wandering into a forest where bad things have happened in the past, people have disappeared. You think, like, ooh, what's going to happen? But it just gets a bit silly, really. There were several times where I was sat there just thinking, God, this is silly. You know, not scared. Like, it was really not, I don't know, it wasn't particularly scary as well. And like, there's obviously it can make you jump, but you know, it's easy to have a kind of silent, loud bang and something like kind of jumps out at you. That's easy to do, but like, I don't know, it wasn't particularly good at sort of sustaining an atmosphere of tension. As we said before with The Girl with All the Gifts, the way horror works is to create this sustained atmosphere of unease that kind of grinds down your defenses so they can, at the right moment break through and really scare you. And they had some kind of set piece scares that weren't particularly scary, and the sustained atmosphere of tension wasn't very good. I was just kind of, a lot of it, I was just thinking, like, this is just a lot of shots of trees and twigs and stuff and some heavy breathing. It's not particularly scary, to any degree.
It is true. I've definitely seen my quota of shots of a camera moving quickly through twigs for the next week or two at least.
And I think, it's just, even though they clearly had more money and a bit more scope to do something, but like, even things like the sound design was really good in the original Blair Witch Project. Like, they could really, like, things like the tent kind of rippling and like the sound of twigs breaking, and you sort of, when they're in the tent, you could hear like something outside or like voices or something that's like, a bit strange. But in this, it was just kind of, I know it's just so obvious jump scares, like it was just kind of big, heavy crashing noises, and bangs and stuff. And it didn't create that atmosphere of tension. It was just kind of seemed a bit daft, really.
Yeah, I particularly enjoyed how for a lot of it, the terror seemed to basically come from the fact they were being chased by an anonymous, heavily breathing thing. It was just like top-level, obvious monster thing of just something behind them going and then running away from it. It's like, based on the evidence of this film, the Blair Witch is an escaped bear.
Yeah.
The next film will just be called The Bear Witch. So
the Blair Witch Project.
Does it? Yeah. It's just not really subtle. I mean, when we're making a sequel to a film best known for its sort of subtle, understated horror, I don't really see how bringing in the bear is the best thing to go with.
Mm.
I mean, there's a bit towards the end, I'll try not to explicitly spoil the ending, but, it's not very good. They find the house from the first film, because obviously they do. Why wouldn't you? And there's 2 of them left at this point. I'll attempt not to say which ones they are. One of them goes inside and it gets chased by general witch shapes. Again, not subtle. And the second one is sort of standing outside, waiting, occasionally shouting the other one's name, as they always do in this film. And then she looks towards the trees, and there's this sort of what looks like sort of white skeletal figure jigging behind one of the trees. And then she sort of screams and runs into the house. Then I was too busy laughing at the jigging skeleton to actually fully comprehend that bit. But yeah, that was just...
Yeah, terrible. It was just silly. It kind of reminded me of like a ghost train, which is not intended as a compliment, in that something would scare you, but then you just laugh at how ridiculous the thing you've been scared by. But it's not in a kind of surreal, intentionally humorous League of Gentlemen way, or like that London play Ghost Stories, which was kind of very Ghost Train and quite silly as well as being quite scary. The scares weren't scary enough, and it wasn't supposed to be funny, so it really kind of came off the rails with this one. Yeah, and it's just, even when they get into like the kind of the big kind of sustained, periods of horror, like kind of the final act of the film, it just didn't feel the tension and didn't feel particularly scared. Sort of jumped once or twice, but in a very obvious way, and I know, it's not inspired by the Blair Witch.
As I said, there were some bits towards the beginning which introduced potentially interesting characters or potentially interesting possible concepts. Like the idea of, in order to make sure they know what's happened to each other, they're wearing these head cameras, these sort of ear clip cameras, which means that they quite easily got an excuse to show sort of footage from the perspective of those head cameras, which does sort of get around the issue of how do we explain why they're just filming all this shit. And there's a bit where they have a drone to make sure they don't get lost. They can just send it up at any time and get a sort of bird's eye view, which is quite a nice bit. It's quite a nice idea, but nothing's really done with it. And yeah, and it does lead to this amazingly crap horror movie bit where the drone after its second use, just randomly crashes and gets stuck in a tree. And that's kind of what I mean by them not really doing anything with it. And the one of the survivors, well, she's a survivor at that point anyway, finds this tree and sees the drone in it. And Perpetual Night has already fallen. She's injured already. She's got a messed up leg. And she decides she's going to climb quite high up in this tree to get the drone back. Even though I can't conceivably see what it could possibly do for her at this point, having a potentially broken drone. I mean, she's not going to be able to click onto the bottom of it and fly away from this bear, is she? And then she climbs the tree, and then it goes wrong in roughly the way you'd expect. I did wonder if they were going to go for the slightly other end of horror and have her arm get slashed to shreds by the rotors of the drone, but they didn't.
No, it wasn't really believable when his person with badly injured leg climbs tree. Was, at that point my suspension of disbelief had kind of completely gone.
And yeah, then they get into the house, and it had a bit of emotional, I don't know, okay, but yeah, personal backstory. I hadn't seen the original Blair Witch until 2 days before we saw the sequel, because, as discussed in previous podcasts, I haven't seen many of the films. So I'd just seen the original, and when they went back to the house, yeah, it had a certain, I don't know, it sparked something in me. I was like, oh shit, it's the house. But as Alastair said, it then descended quite quickly into ghost trainy stuff. There's a sort of a bit in a tunnel, which was, it was, the way they shot it did successfully evoke a nice bit of claustrophobia. I did feel a bit sort of, shit. It did feel visceral. It felt like I was in the moment for those few minutes. So that was nice. Although the choreography of that part is quite confusing. I'm not 100% sure where she was meant to be going in this tunnel. But it was quite a nice bit of claustrophobia.
Yeah, like I say, that bit was good, or at least all right. When she's trapped in the tunnel trying to crawl away from something, yeah, it was claustrophobic, it was tense. That was right at the end of the film, so you really want to be hitting your kind of really high tension point then. It had some good bits, there was some body horror stuff that was at times generally unpleasant. One of the characters gets injured and their sort of injury kind of becomes infected and spreads in kind of quite unpleasant way. And there was some kind of quite gross stuff involving pus and maggots. And that was that was some good body horror, and I think body horror can be overused. There was definitely a trend for a while of a lot of films that relied very heavily on body horror. Eli Roth is some of the worst examples in the films he made, but this was kind of a bit of body horror, kind of just to to take you out of your comfort zone to increase the tension. That was good. And I was generous sense of kind of, I'm feeling this is quite unpleasant. You're starting to elicit emotional reaction from me, which is what you want from a film. But they didn't really do anything with it, or it didn't build anything else. It didn't get worse in any way. It didn't sustain the atmosphere and tension. So any good bits they had didn't really go anywhere, and so the film didn't really work.
Yeah, and that sort of ties into the body horror is one of the few aspects which isn't really in the first film, which I think does give it a certain air of, oh, this is interesting and new. I'm sure it's huge spoilers to say in the first Blair Witch Project there were, little voodoo stick men hanging from trees and piles of rocks appearing out of nowhere, and you'll be surprised to hear that both those things are in the sequel as well. And there's a bit where someone says, I'm so sorry, to a camera as well. And obviously they're in the same forest, still doing found footage. When you're repeating yourself in that way, it does start to become a bit atmosphere free. At first it might be oh shit, it's that thing, that means stuff is about to go down, but after the first couple of times it just becomes, oh, you're doing this again, are you? And yeah, there's another bit where one of the characters grabs one of the little voodoo stickmen out of a tree and in a fit of anger twists it to bits, and then their entire body immediately twists to bits.
Yeah, that was something new and unpleasant they added.
Yeah, that was a nice bit, to be honest. I mean, again, because of the way it's shot, it was slightly hard to tell what was going on at that point, but it's a nice idea, it's a nice new introduction. At that point, the film badly needed some, new ideas that were actually good. But sadly, these bits were a tad few and far between.
I mean, it had a few, sort of possibly things, interesting ideas, the way they use modern technology, because obviously in the 15 years since the original Blair Witch Project, film technology has moved on quite a lot. It's a handheld film technology. It doesn't really do anything. It doesn't add to the tension of the atmosphere. It just wasn't, particularly scary. And even when it got to the end, it was just kind of not fazed by the ending.
Yeah, it's. I don't know. I know. When you take on let's do a sequel to the Blair Witch Project, you have to go, well, it's got to have recognisable stuff in it, so it follows on. But at the same time, we've got to feel like we're adding something new. And unfortunately, with the exception of the handful of things we mentioned, most of the changes they've made are for the worse, and the few bits of promising change don't really go anywhere. And yeah, it's a not very good, somewhat unnecessary sequel. Sorry.
Yeah, I thought both the witch and the neon demon, which we've seen this year, were much scarier. The neon demon especially really got under my skin. And the witch, I found the creepiness and the unsettling nature of the whole thing really did work much better than it did for the Blair Witch. As we discussed in the previous episode, the witch kind of did fall to pieces a bit.
It didn't fall to pieces. It wasn't as routinely bad as this is. It just, unfortunately, didn't quite pull off the ending, which is a shame, because that means that's what sticks with you in your mind. But it was a much, much better film.
Yeah, and the Neon Demon was much good at unsettling you and get under your skin. But this one not so much, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's just unfortunately, again, studio goes right in this age of franchiseness of franchising. The studio looks at this film and goes, that was successful, we'll do another one. What was successful about it? And unfortunately the answer is it was just quite well executed and good. And not because there's something amazingly memorable and important and appealing about the idea of found footage, a witch and the woods. You can't just make another one with roughly the same tropes and throw in some twigs and the noise of a bear and expect it to automatically make money, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think we've moved on a lot. 1999. I mean, I think we're much more cynical now, and we're less willing to kind of buy into the mythology of the film, whereas like the mythology and kind of the idea that like maybe it was real and sort of really worked for the original Blair Witch project to make it a kind of the first sort of viral hit. I mean, things were just different in the 90s. We were Tony Blair was in power. There was like we were more affluent and happier and stuff and more willing to buy into these things. I mean, I don't think it really works in this sort of more cynical age. We're not willing to get bought into it.
I think you're overselling the political aspects really. I think it's just not a very good film. I watched Blair Witch Project for the first time a couple of days ago. It's still quite well made and decent. The viral marketing would have been all very well and good. The film would still have flopped if it had been shit, I think, or at least it would still have been it would not have been as well remembered as it is. Lastly today we're doing Uber, not just a modern app-based taxi firm, but also a comic by Kieron Gillen and Caanan White from Avatar Press about the idea of the Nazis developing superpeople, basically, people with superhero-esque superpowers in the end of World War II and using this to push back and continue onwards from the war. It's a comic that's got about 25 issues, I think, under its belt. It started a fair few years ago now. It did have 25 issues leading up to like a big turning point, and then it went off for a while to, I think, basically get some more issues stockpiled, and it's actually coming back in November with its second act, which is, I think, called Uber Invasion. So this is kind of timely. So yeah, I recommended it to Alastair last week, and we've read the first 6 issues, although because of the way it's numbered, that's actually issues 0 and then 1 to 5, because they've got a 0 issue, which I think is just a thing that comic companies do, so they can basically have 2 first issues for their series. And yes, Alastair, what did you think of Uber?
I really liked it. Really good. I really got into it, and I really want to read more and to find out where the story goes. I've had it sort of had interest in World War II, and I've read books and seen quite a lot of films about it, and I think this works quite well of like folding the kind of mythology of this kind of slightly fantastical story into actual history and kind of weaving it through history. I thought it was a really interesting choice to set it right at the end of the war. So the Reich has pretty much been destroyed and the Germans are pretty much on the verge of surrender when this kind of technology to create superhumans, sort of Panzermensch, they call them tank men, sort of comes about, and they kind of are able to, the Nazis are able to push back. But there's generally a sense that so much has been destroyed, what can they hope to accomplish? Because they're right at the end of the war. Can they force a ceasefire? Or can they just inflict as much damage and destruction as possible? And even though they have these superhumans, they can't change the entire sort of nature of the war in that they're still, outnumbered on the verge of collapse. So there's a real tension there. But also you get the Allied side of the story, and the Allies are obviously completely wrong-footed by this. They're just on the cusp of victory, and now you kind of the Germans are pushing back much harder. So there's a real tension, and this kind of leads to an arms race as the Allies try to create their own Panzermensch or tank men. Their tension builds up in the last issue I read. There's a kind of a first conflict between Allied and Nazi Ubermen, and that's a pretty grim fight scene.
Yeah, there's 2 classes, aren't there? There's sort of the Panzermensch, which are the sort of foot soldiers, the ones there's like loads of them, and then there's these like the Ubermensch, the like battleship class super mega ones. Yeah,
they're kind of much more powerful and much sort of on a much higher level. And the big sort of fight between the 2 battleship class is sort of enhanced figures is a really grim kind of quite sort of destructive fight scene. You really get a sense of like the power involved. Just the way the comic is drawn is like phenomenal. Just it shows like the kind of the raw power and physicality of these sort of enhanced humans, the sort of the grimness of the war, and like kind of how the sort of the blood and death. The opening of Saving Private Ryan when there's the beach invasion, and it really shows just how grim and nasty war is. It's not sanitized at all, and Uber is just like that. There is no sanitization of how like grim and sort of nasty the war is. And even though they're kind of this fantastical concept of superhumans or Ubermensch or Panzermensch or whatever you want to call them fighting each other, it really gets across how disgustingly visceral and kind of how bloody it is. It really doesn't pull any of its punches.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as it's a film, I haven't seen Saving Private Ryan, but Uber is definitely pretty good at the grimness of war. That's definitely one of its, its big points. I mean, it's my first bullet point on this is, it's been a while since I read this, I forgot how horrible it is. So yeah, the sheer volume of, like, bloody violence or details of the, like, surprisingly enough, quite unpleasant Nazi experiments required to create these tank men, it does get quite disgusting. I mean, I think there's some text pieces by Kieron Gillen at the end of each issue. Did you read those?
Yeah, I read some of them. I didn't read all of them, but yeah, it does go into like the detail of like his research and stuff, and kind of trying to sort of accurately bring the story to life.
In one of them, I think, possibly a couple, he talks about the ethical aspect of like, is this a story that should be told? I mean, could he be accused of glorifying the Nazis in some way, or is it just something that particularly needs to be said? And I think a lot of the way he's squared it off with himself is to push the horribleness fairly far. Stress the fact that this is grim, this is unpleasant, this is not cool in any way.
No, and I think that really works, and it gets it across very well. And I was thinking about this issue that, like, yeah, there is a morality aspect in making, a story about the Nazis, and in which Nazis are protagonists, and there are certainly moral questions there, and as time goes by, kind of the memory of the war and the Nazis kind of fades, and it becomes a bit more of a sort of thing you can kind of use for humor and stuff, and we kind of forget how terrible and grim it was. And I think Uber is really good at taking the horrors of the Nazis and the terrible things they did, and also the horrors of war and how really bitter and destructive the Second World War was. Taking that and kind of by adding this fantastical element to it, it kind of makes it more accessible. In the same way that like X-Men can make, racism and civil rights and discrimination more accessible by marrying it with a sort of this more accessible fantasy concept. And I think it's important because to keep these historical events accessible, because the memory does fade, and we don't want it to be something that becomes confined only to history books and hard-hitting documentaries that may be very well made but don't have a huge audience because there aren't that many people really interested in history. But we need to keep the memory alive of how terrible this stuff was, so that when we remember what it's like, and no one's ever tempted to do anything like this ever again. I think a fair comparison is the film 12 Years a Slave, which is an interesting film, and I saw people went to see that and they were like, that film is grim and awful, but I don't know why people are so shocked, because obviously slavery was awful. And yes, obviously slavery was awful, but the further it disappears into the past, the more the memory of how terrible it was fades, and people become almost like blasé about it. And it's important to have a film, a visual, visceral reminder of what this thing was like, so that we don't forget how terrible it was. And Uber is the same for the Nazis, and I think it really did work well in that, in that regard.
Yeah, but at the same time, yeah, it's awful. If you don't want to spend your free time consuming entertainment that mainlines the horrors of World War II into you, then that's a fairly reasonable angle to take, I think. But it does really well. He's clearly done an absolute fuckload of research. I've read a fair bit of other Kieron Gillen work. I think I've read the major stuff like The Wicked and Divine and Phonogram, and his fair bit of his Marvel work. And this is notable for being the hardest to sort of clearly identify with the rest. His other work has a sort of certain poppy momentum and snark, and a sort of focus on the big cool moments, which makes you come away going sort of, wow, holy shit. And a lot of that sort of snappiness and poppiness is very absent here, which, based on what we've said and what he says in his text pieces, is definitely deliberate. But I think there is a connecting line in there. I think there's definitely a lot of scenes and issues of Uber are building to a sort of climactic holy shit moment. He's still clearly very good at those. It's just that you're not smiling when you utter your holy shit. You're not saying, oh, that was cool. It's more of a sort of numb
awful
sense of but a numb sense of horror.
Yeah, no, exactly. And you can tell he's put a lot of work in and a lot of research. I think the only way this could also work is by really bringing the period to life in detail. Like the depiction of the devastation of Berlin really does get across like kind of the horrors of war, the degree to which there's sort of utter devastation that, especially like aerial bombardment brought, and sort of carpet bombing. And he's brought in like loads of aspects of history to really bring it to life, like things, like the Zoo Tower, which is interesting architectural and was a part of the Nazi defences of Berlin, and like that's in it. He's brought in historical figures, as well as Hitler and Churchill, obvious ones. He's brought in like there's Albert Speers in it. Alan Turing at one point. It weaves in kind of actual kind of historical events. The timeline is very clearly laid out of where things work, and brings in the history of the war. There's a bit when the Panzermensch have a sort of advance towards Romania because Germany needs access to oil if it's going to sort of refuel and rebuild its war machine, and like those kind of historical details and like kind of the way they talk about military maneuvers do bring it to life and make it believable, and you need to have it the story needs to be believable.
Based on his text pieces, it was pitched to him as the idea of World War II with superheroes, again World War II with superpowers, and he sort of ended up having to find his own take on it, which obviously ended up being this very stark focus on the idea of making it seem plausible. I mean, obviously it's not plausible, and obviously there's sort of a central sci-fi concept in there and they have this stuff that sometimes gives people superpowers.
Yeah,
but making the superhero stuff fit in, as you say, you could say a lot of the value of this is that it brings the horrors of that era back into sort of sharp relief when they've sort of perhaps faded into the past of it. But obviously bringing in superpowers could distract from that, but by, making it clear that superpowers can fuck up a person in the same way that any other horrible war machine I could mention can is, I think, quite important to the piece. They make it clear that these are just weapons. I'm trying to say this without explicitly spoiling the end of the first arc, but there's this idea of Uber as having a very sort of matter-of-fact approach to things like combat, like in a standard Marvel superhero comic, the plucky underdog hero who goes up against a more powerful villain would probably win. In Uber, ultimately, a plucky underdog hero who doesn't have the same power level as the villain is probably going to get shredded.
Yeah.
Again, that makes it a much grimmer note, but I think it's probably important to have that element in it, because you ultimately can't go into something like this with a sort of it'll be alright in the end attitude. You can't present it as something that has a nice narrative resolution and a sense that the moral good will come through in the end, because that's just what it does. I mean, again, it does make it a fairly bleak read, but I think it also makes it a much better bit of fiction.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you there. I found it a bit difficult maybe to follow at first because it introduces a lot of different characters and a lot of different plot lines. So it is kind of like a lot to take on at first. I'm not sure to what degree it's just because I'm not particularly familiar with comics, and that means that I tend to find them at first hard to get into because I'm not really familiar with the way the story is told so well, so it's harder to pick up the characters. But with all the comics I've read, although I find it a bit confusing at first, as I read and get into it, it all falls into place. So I think that's just a kind of a skill I need to acquire.
I think I think we were saying something similar about this regarding The Wire in last episode. I think there is always you're introducing something with a spooling, a scope, and a cast as this. I think it's always going to be a bit confusing at first until you zero in on it. I read it again for this podcast. I already read it just over a year ago, and I at first didn't entirely fully feel I was sensed in on the characters until the second issue or so, I think. Once it became clear who the main characters actually were, because yes, in the first issue especially, the Zero issue, whatever, there's a lot of, general males in military uniform.
Yeah.
Yeah, once you eventually work out which is which and who's important, by the end of it, when certain ones of those meet certain unpleasant fates, you do know who they are and care.
Yeah.
Or, well, maybe care is the wrong word since they are Nazis, but, know who they are and understand their emotions in that scene.
No, exactly.
Yeah, I don't think that's a weakness necessarily. I think it's one of these things going into a story. I'm sure you could read it again, immediately after, with a full knowledge of who everyone is, and you might get very slightly more out of the very first issue. But I don't think that's a weakness of your comic reading. No,
I'd prefer possibly a bit more characterization from the Panzermensch themselves, especially the battleship class ones. I mean, they're in it quite a lot, but at the point I'm at, I haven't really got much of a sense of their character and their lives. I assume you'll get more of that in the future.
There's 3 of them, aren't there?
Yeah, there's 3 German battleship class.
The female one gets a bit more. I think possibly it's deliberate. There are moments in these first 5 or 6 issues where Claudia, is it?
Yeah, that's her name.
Comes across as slightly more sympathetic, maybe, so which is possibly why it's deliberate that she then gets to do the biggest atrocity in the final episode, just to again neuter any slight sympathy you might have been going towards her. Considering the size of the cast, I can see they are meant to be these sort of remote godlike figures. I quite like the level of sort of gentle characterization you're getting. The blonde one, Marcus, I think, maybe.
Yeah,
he comes across as a bit of a dick, doesn't he?
Yeah. You do get a sense of your characters, yeah.
And it does go for a couple of years, and there's more to come, so I think and there will be more of that.
Yeah, so maybe I should keep reading and I'll get more a sense of those characters. But I did I thought a really good story. It's very engrossing.
Obviously, I do have historical retellings or alternate histories as an obvious win for you in my recommendations. That's why my very first recommendation was the Manhattan Projects. But yeah, I did feel good about this one, yeah. And yeah, the art was very good. As I say, it didn't flinch from doing the sort of the grim stuff needed to get all the effects we talked about earlier. I felt like the colours could have been a bit more subtle sometimes. They were sometimes just a bit on the nose and there, but they didn't really get in the way of the story. So,
well, there's a lot of sort of grey and black in the kind of destroyed ruins of Berlin, and then they're kind of punctuated by bright crimson for when someone's killed, basically. And sort of the kind of the disruption field, which is the kind of superpower that these enhanced people can sort of use, is blue. And so, again, it's a kind of relief, used as a release colour against a quite dark background. So it's sort of blue sort of tinge. The art is very good. It's very viscerally drawn, and it really does get you into the story. So I think we shouldn't just talk about how great Karen Gillen's writing, and we should also talk about how great the art is as well, because that's what makes the story. That makes the story as much as the writing.
Alastair, they're making the easily done Karen Gillen, Kieron Gillen distinction.
Oh, sorry.
but yeah, no, I'm glad you like this. As I say, there's about 25 issues in existence at the moment. I assume they're either on Comixology or in like collected editions. And Uber Invasion, the second, I think the second half. I think he's basically said there's going to be another. The second chunk is going to be about the same length, and then that's the end. So yeah, the second chunk starts in November, December, one of those two.
I look forward to reading more of it because it is a very good story. And yeah, if you're interested in history, World War II, especially kind of like alternate history with fantasy or sci-fi elements added in. Yeah, this is very good, and I'd highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in those areas, because I did really enjoy reading it. I don't know if enjoy is the right word, because some of it is properly some of it can be quite disturbing and grim, but it elicited a powerful emotional reaction from me, which is what you want from your art.
Alright, so that was Uber, another successful recommendation by me. Alastair, what am I looking at for next episode?
So for my recommendation, we're going to continue in the grim vein, but this time with a non-fantasy based story. And I'm going to recommend to you a film, Dead Man's Shoes, also starring Paddy Considine, who we talked about earlier.
Okay.
Directed by Shane Meadows, who is a sort of British independent filmmaker from the East Midlands. He's made a lot of really good films. He's probably most famous for This Is England.
Oh yeah, that's what I've heard of him from. Not that I've seen it, obviously, but that's what I've heard of him from.
So he directed that film, and he's heavily involved in the 3 TV series they made after it. This isn't a historical drama like those films are. This is a gritty crime thriller. It's got some properly disturbing moments, and Paddy Considine is very good in it, so I'm looking forward to see what you think of it.
Okay, cool. I will get that sorted for next time. Okay, and that was all your Moderate Fantasy Violence for this fortnight. If you want some more, you can go to moderatefantasyviolence.com, where you can get all our episodes, as well as the occasional essay when we have time to write one, and our little deleted scenes under the excessive fantasy violence brand, although there are less of those nowadays because we've got slightly better at shutting up. You could also now get us on YouTube, actually. If you search for Moderate Fantasy Violence, will hopefully come up. It's basically just a feed from our podcast account, which dumps the episodes on YouTube with a static image. But yeah, if that's how you like listening to podcasts, you now can. So go nuts. And of course, if you want to go onto iTunes or Stitcher especially and give us a nice review, then that would greatly help our world domination plans, or at least our plans to increase the number of people who listen to the podcast. You can also follow us on Facebook by searching for Moderate Fantasy Violence and going to our Facebook like page. You can also follow us on Twitter, where we are at MFV Podcast. I'm Alastair Ball. You can find me on Twitter at AlastairJRBall. You can also find my writing at redtrainblog.com. Okay, and I've been Nick Bryan. You can find me on Twitter as @NickMB, or you can go to nickbryan.com for news of my self-published crime books, especially at the moment, as when this is released on a Thursday, the 4th one will be coming out the following Tuesday. So if you've ever been interested, there's never been a better time to get involved and bump up my stats. The first one is free on Kindle, the others are a couple of quid. It's a sort of mismatched duo crime thing. The 4th one is about the locked room murder of a YouTuber. So to mark this occasion, I've been doing a few YouTube videos. I've done 2 to date. I'm going to try and get at least 1 more in before the book comes out. And again, you can find all that at nickbryan.com if you're interested. And that really is it. We'll be back in a fortnight with the long-awaited Marvel Netflix series Luke Cage, which I'm very up for. We're going to try and cover the first half of that series, I think. And there'll also be the new HBO show Westworld, the film Spaceship, and of course, as we discussed a minute or so ago, the film Dead Man's Shoes. But yep, that's next episode, and we will see you in a couple of weeks. Bye. Bye. I was trying to pivot towards a Tony Blair Witch joke there, but it never really happened. Oh, God. Look, you can try and compete with the Blair Witch joke if you want, but I think the Blair Witch is definitely the best joke. Anyway, we're getting a bit messy at this stage. Any more in terms of actual points? It wasn't very good. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, Blair Witch. Sorry, Tony Blair. Ultimately, the War of Iraq may have been a better idea than this film. Let's cut that.